one way I look at these issues is, and I'm sure you've heard this, but is with the triple bottom line. There's so much that we talk about as just the financial piece, but when you talk about the triple bottom line, you're also talking about not just financial capital, but the social capital, and then of course the natural capital. And I think that's really what our work is about, is looking at those three deliverables, if you will, or those three bottom lines. And as was said earlier, local government is really a place where a lot of that happens. And so the social capital, I think, is one of the things that is so key to the work we do. And the surfboard process, I think part of its success is the fact that, and Bill Ruckelshaus was just a champion in trying to develop this, is the strength of those watershed groups, those lead entities which develop the projects that we would fund. The key was to have those groups be as diverse as possible, with as many elected officials as possible. And it's tough because you know your schedules are super busy and it's difficult to sort of carve out that time. But that is the place as an elected official where a lot of the politics on these tough issues can be resolved. So if you've got a property owner, a riverside owner, or a farmer, or someone who's, you know, trying to be a steward, but yet maybe is having some trouble with some of the regulations, and then you have, you know, a strong environmental voice, and then you have you as an elected official who is trying to, how do we pay for these issues? That is a place at the watershed level where people are really engaged and knowledgeable. If you strengthen and support those efforts as an elected official, you will have a lot of those questions answered before it gets to you at that vote at the, you know, the council or the commission or wherever you are. And so when Bill and I were, you know, working the surfboard, we really would go around and try to talk the local officials to get engaged at that watershed level, because in fact it would make their job more easy politically. I think the natural capital piece is pretty obvious. We have, I think here in the Puget Sound, we understand that our financial capital is really based on the strength of our natural capital. And it's not, I don't think, because people are bad or evil, but it's just, there was, you know, 100 years ago or maybe 150 years ago to about maybe 60 years ago, we externalized a lot of our costs on the environment. And we just, you know, extracted value from the environment. Well, as we've learned more, we've realized we can't continue to do that. We need to continue to reinvest and regenerate that natural capital, or we are going to see a diminishment in both our social and our economic capital. Elwha Dams, I think, is a pretty prime example. Back in 1910, when they were built without any, they were basically illegal, right? They were required to have fish passage. They did not have fish passage. But Aldwell, the guy who built them, said, you know, we got all this timber, we got a timber town, we need power, so they built the dams. And, you know, in 1910, that made a lot of sense. Well, in 1990 and in 2000, you started to realize we have really limited this phenomenal natural resource of 70 miles of watershed, 70 miles of really pristine habitat in the national park that could be growing salmon. And it's sort of, you know, that long-term value of having a functioning ecosystem like the Elwha River. Now we realize that's the type of investment to reinstate or strengthen or regenerate that natural capital. And I think the financial capital is a challenge you face every day in working with your budget and sort of trying to allocate your limited resources and your ability to generate revenue. But again, there's huge value when we combine the social and the natural capital to help us work on our bottom lines, our financial piece. And that's one of the reasons we're in a second special session in Olympia, because there's some debate over what kind of long-term investments we should make in the state. Some of us feel we have a structural problem as far as meeting the needs of a 21st century state. Other folks don't feel we have that challenge, and that's why we're kind of banging heads. But we'll get that resolved in the next probably couple of weeks, hopefully. So the other piece I think that is a tension that we deal with, and Jamie talked about it a little bit, is that regulation versus restoration. I think that duality is challenging. And we dealt with this on the surfboard. We certainly talk about this in the Puget Sound, and there's folks that say, why should you, acquire this easement? Why should you help this landowner be a steward? Why don't you just regulate it because that's what we need to do? And in some ways, regulation is probably fiscally less expensive. But as far as social capital, and I think in the end, natural capital, I don't think it really gets you to the place because of long-term stewardship, because that's really what we want. And I think you really get long-term stewardship when you empower that landowner, whether it's a rancher, a farmer, a homeowner, to manage and be a good steward of that resource. And so there's tension there, and I think we used to, in Clallam County, we have a fairly strong, it's not large, it's not like Skagit, but it's a certain important economic sector. The agricultural sector is an important economic sector. And so we have, manure and waste issues we'd have to manage. And ecology would come in, and ecology would be the bad cop, and say, well, you guys, you're like polluting the water, and you got to. And then we'd bring in the conservation district, which would be, the white knight, and they would solve the problem. So there's kind of this phrase I have in my mind these days is a club that looks like a carrot. So you kind of like, how do I do this? So it's really, well, this isn't a but you're really, really nudging these people pretty, seriously to do the right thing and be the right steward. But that tension is always there, I think, between the regulation and the restoration, and finding that balance, again, goes back to trying to make these watershed groups and these local groups as robust as possible, because you can build public acceptance. And I think that's another sort of overriding, I think, part of this is constant education and outreach. Because I think it's not that, there's some just resistance, but again, if we look at the long-term need to strengthen our natural capital, people, when you sit down and explain that and take the time to work that out within the local watershed group or lead entity or whatever group might be, you get a sense of, wow, this is how we move forward. And of course, you're not going to get everybody, as you know that, as an elected official. I always felt the key to staying elected was not pissing everybody off together. Just you had certain groups who were sort of annoyed with you at certain times, but if you had all of them annoyed with you at one time, you're in trouble. But you kind of keep the ball moving and keep moving forward. And so just like in any watershed group, you're not going to always get everybody to buy in completely, but you get a process and you get an understanding that helps you, I think, move the ball forward. Alan Mulally, who a lot of you know, is rebuilt Boeing during the crisis, when they were sort of really in tough competition with Airbus, and then went on to rebuild Ford after they were losing they had sort of lost their value. He had a speech, and maybe some of you have seen this, about a year ago in front of the City Club in Seattle, and the reporter asked him from the Puget Sound Business Journal, like, what are your key? You've been pretty successful. What's sort of your key to doing this? And he had a couple of things that I think are pretty helpful and applicable to the work we do. One of the things he said is, don't speak until you know. Listen and then speak. And that's, I think, a Stephen Covey thing. But he also talked about being inclusive, trust the process, be inclusive, and include as many people as possible. And I think that's an important message. And then the other thing that he said is a duality. You have to keep the vision in your mind, but you also have to keep the reality in your mind. And you have to build your strategy around that duality, and then once you have your strategy, you implement it relentlessly. You constantly implement that. And I think, and the other thing, the final thing he said is you got to have fun. And I think that's also important, to make sure you're having fun and people see the value in what you're doing. Because these issues are incredibly challenging. They don't have simple answers. And they're impacting people's land. They're impacting people's livelihood. They're certainly impacting our future and how we're going to live and work and prosper in the Puget Sound Basin. So, you know, we need to be relentless. We need to be continually working on these things and understand that that process is not going to get us to maybe an immediate clear answer right away, but trust that process and be inclusive and, you know, move forward.